Hey everyone, like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so we can uncover today's jaw-dropping story together. The police were standing at the door, asking polite questions, unaware that the answer to a missing child case was already inside the home, not hidden in a basement, not buried in the backyard, but inside the very apartment they were being welcomed into. Months had already passed, and according to investigators, a 12-year-old girl was already dead. This is the story of Jacqueline Mimi Torres-García, and the moment when officers spoke face-to-face with her mother while her daughter's body was allegedly still inside the house. On the surface, it looked like a routine visit. No sirens, no forced entry, just officers knocking on the door of an apartment, following up on concerns about a child who hadn't been seen in a while. Body camera footage shows calm voices, measured questions, and a mother who appears cooperative. Nothing about the moment suggested they were standing at the edge of something horrific. But what we know now changes everything. According to investigators, by the time police arrived at Karla Garcia's apartment, her daughter Jacqueline, known to family as Mimi, had already been dead for months. Not missing, not runaway, not lost, dead. And yet, the truth stayed hidden, even as officers stood just feet away. Jacqueline was 12 years old. Friends and relatives described her as quiet, gentle, and artistic. She liked drawing and music. She was the kind of child who didn't demand attention, which often meant she didn't receive much scrutiny either. In school, her absence eventually raised concerns. Teachers noticed she stopped showing up. Friends asked questions. Excuses followed. Police say those excuses came from the people closest to her. According to newly unsealed arrest warrants, Jacqueline's mother, Karla Garcia, told different versions of the same story over time. Sometimes Jacqueline was with relatives, sometimes she had run away, sometimes she was staying elsewhere. Each explanation sounded just believable enough to delay alarm, but not enough to stop questions forever. That's how police ended up at the apartment. The body cam footage, released much later, is difficult to watch, not because of what officers see, but because of what they don't. They speak to Karla calmly. They ask about Jacqueline. They ask when she was last seen. Karla responds without panic, without urgency, without the kind of fear you'd expect from a mother whose child was truly missing. She invites officers in. According to investigators, this is one of the most chilling aspects of the case. Police were inside the home. They were close. And yet, they had no idea they were standing in a space that allegedly held the remains of a child. At that time, officers did not have probable cause to search the apartment thoroughly. There was no smell reported, no visible signs of a crime, no immediate evidence forcing action. And so, after speaking with Karla, they left. The truth stayed buried, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically. What police now allege is almost impossible to comprehend. Investigators say Jacqueline died inside that apartment. The cause of death is still part of the ongoing legal process, but court documents describe abuse, neglect, and a pattern of behavior that prosecutors say led to her death. They allege that after Jacqueline died, the adults in her life didn't call for help. They didn't report her death. Instead, they hid it, and they kept living. According to police, Karla Garcia was not alone. Her boyfriend, Jonathan Nanita, and her sister, Jacqueline Garcia, are also facing serious charges. Investigators allege that all three played a role, either in the abuse, the concealment of the body, or both. For months, Jacqueline was gone, but life around her continued. Bills were paid, social media posts were made, days passed, seasons changed, and still, no one knew where Mimi was. Nearly a year later, the case took a turn that stunned even seasoned investigators. Police say Jacqueline's body was finally discovered far from the apartment, sealed inside a plastic storage tote, abandoned behind a vacant home. The condition of the remains, according to warrants, suggested she had been there for a long time. That discovery reopened every unanswered question. Why was her body moved? Who knew? Who helped? And how did this go unnoticed for so long? When investigators connected the remains back to Jacqueline, the earlier police visit took on a horrifying new meaning. That body cam footage wasn't just a check-in anymore, it was a moment where the truth nearly surfaced and then slipped away again. Public reaction was immediate and intense. People demanded to know how this could happen, how police could miss something so severe, how a child could disappear in plain sight. But experts were quick to explain something uncomfortable. Cases like this don't usually look like crimes at first. There was no frantic 911 call, no visible violence, no obvious crime scene, just a child who slowly vanished and adults who provided answers that delayed suspicion. Investigators now believe that was intentional. According to court documents, Karla Garcia allegedly worked to hide Jacqueline's death. Giving explanations meant to deflect attention. Her calm demeanor during the police encounter is now being examined closely. Prosecutors argue it wasn't composure, it was deception. Her defense has not yet presented its full case, and all suspects are presumed innocent until proven guilty. But the allegations alone paint a deeply disturbing picture. A child suffering in silence, a death concealed, and a lie maintained for nearly a year. For law enforcement, this case has become a nightmare scenario. Not because officers didn't care, but because the system depends on visible warning signs. And when those signs are carefully hidden, even trained professionals can miss what's right in front of them. For Jacqueline, there were no second chances. As the case moves through the courts, more details are expected to emerge. Autopsy results, text messages, witness statements, and possibly explanations from the people accused of betraying her. But one moment will always stand out. Police officers doing what they were trained to do, standing inside an apartment, talking calmly to a mother, while according to investigators, the truth was already inside the home with them. A child was gone. A lie was alive, and no one knew yet how dark this story would become. This was only the beginning. By the time police walked away from Karla Garcia's apartment that day, the case still felt unresolved, but not urgent. Jacqueline Mimi Torres-García was listed as missing, not endangered. There were no alarms, no forced searches, no immediate follow-up that suggested a child's life had already ended, and that small difference changed everything. Investigators now say that moment bought time. Time for lies to settle, time for stories to harden, time for the truth to be pushed even further away. After that visit, life around the apartment continued in a way that would later horrify everyone who learned what police believe had already happened. Karla kept showing up to work. Her boyfriend, Jonathan Nanita, came and went. Her sister, Jacqueline Garcia, remained part of the picture. Neighbors didn't report screaming or violence. There were no obvious signs of panic. From the outside, it looked like a family dealing with a troubled child who had disappeared. But behind the scenes, the story police now tell is far darker. According to arrest warrants, Jacqueline did not simply die suddenly. Investigators believe she endured long-term abuse and neglect inside that home. They allege she was isolated, mistreated, and denied basic care. This wasn't a single bad night. Prosecutors say it was a pattern, one that escalated over time until it ended in tragedy. What makes this case especially disturbing is how ordinary everything else looked. Jacqueline had been slowly disappearing before she ever died. School records show increasing absences. Teachers were told she was sick, then that she had moved, then that she was staying with family. Each explanation worked just long enough to prevent a deeper investigation. By the time school officials pressed harder, months had passed. Friends noticed too. Jacqueline stopped answering messages. She stopped showing up. Some assumed she had changed schools. Others thought her family had moved. Children don't always know how to question these things, and by the time adults do, it's often too late. Police say Karla Garcia knew exactly how to answer questions without triggering alarm. Her explanations were calm, controlled, and vague. She didn't provide details that could be checked easily. She didn't offer timelines that could be challenged. Everything stayed just blurry enough. That same pattern shows up again and again in the warrants. Investigators say Jonathan Nanita played a critical role as well. According to police, he was not a bystander. They allege he participated in the abuse and helped conceal what happened after Jacqueline died. Text messages, witness statements, and digital records are now being examined to determine how involved he was and how long he knew the truth. Then there's Jacqueline Garcia, Karla's sister. Police allege she helped after Jacqueline's death, including assisting with moving and hiding the body. Prosecutors say this wasn't panic or confusion. It was a choice, a decision to protect adults instead of a child. If proven, that decision turned a tragedy into a prolonged deception. As investigators rebuilt the timeline, one question kept coming up. Why wasn't Jacqueline reported missing immediately? In most cases, parents are the first to call police. In this one, police had to come knocking. That delay alone raised red flags once the truth came out. But at the time, there was no proof. Only a missing child and explanations that didn't quite add up, but didn't cross the legal threshold either. This is where many true crime cases live and die, in the gray space between suspicion and certainty. Behind closed doors, detectives continued digging. They reviewed phone records. They checked social media. They spoke to relatives who hadn't seen Jacqueline in months, but assumed someone else had. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle and another layer of disbelief. No one wanted to believe the worst. Then came the discovery that shattered any remaining doubt. Nearly a year after Jacqueline was last seen alive, police say her body was found sealed inside a plastic storage tote, abandoned behind an empty house. The location was not random. Investigators believe it was chosen for privacy and distance. Far enough from the apartment to delay discovery, close enough to access without drawing attention. The condition of the remains told a devastating story. Time had erased many answers, but not the truth. This was Jacqueline. The moment her identity was confirmed, everything changed. The earlier police visit was no longer routine. It became haunting. Officers had been inside the home months after Jacqueline was already dead, according to investigators. They had spoken to her mother. They had listened to explanations. And then they had left. Public reaction was swift and emotional. Many asked how this could happen, how police could miss something so serious. But experts were quick to point out a painful reality. Police can't search a home without legal cause. Calm behavior, even suspicious calm, isn't a crime. And that's what makes this case so unsettling. There was no screaming confession, no blood, no obvious evidence, just a child who stopped existing in public, and adults who answered questions carefully. As arrests were made, the charges reflected the seriousness of what investigators believe occurred. Child abuse, failure to report a death, concealment of a body. Each charge carried heavy consequences, and together they painted a picture of sustained betrayal. Still, many questions remain unanswered. What happened in Jacqueline's final days? Who knew she was dead, and when? Why did no one speak up sooner? Prosecutors say those answers will come at trial. For now, the body cam footage remains one of the most chilling elements of the case. Not because it shows violence, but because it shows normalcy. Officers standing in a home, a mother answering questions, a moment where the truth sat just out of reach. And that's what haunts people the most. Because if it could happen there, quietly, calmly, without warning, it could happen anywhere. As the investigation deepened, detectives began to uncover more about what life inside that apartment may have really been like. And what they found would suggest Jacqueline's suffering didn't start at the end. It started long before anyone was looking, as investigators began peeling back the layers of Jacqueline Mimi Torres-Garcia's life. A disturbing pattern started to emerge, one that suggested her disappearance was not sudden, and her death was not unexpected inside that home. According to police, the signs had been there long before officers ever knocked on Karla Garcia's door. They just hadn't been connected yet. Detectives went back to the beginning, reviewing school records, medical history, and messages exchanged between family members. What they found was a slow, troubling unraveling. Jacqueline's attendance at school had become irregular well before she vanished completely. Teachers documented concerns. Emails were sent. Meetings were requested. Each time, there was an explanation. Jacqueline was sick. Jacqueline was struggling emotionally. Jacqueline was going through a phase. Nothing that, on its own, demanded police intervention. But, taken together, it now looked like something else entirely. According to arrest warrants, investigators believe Jacqueline was being isolated inside the apartment. They allege she was not allowed the same freedoms as other children her age. She wasn't seen playing outside. She wasn't regularly interacting with friends. Her world, police say, had slowly shrunk down to the walls of that apartment and the adults inside it. Former neighbors later told police they rarely saw Jacqueline. Some assumed she lived elsewhere. Others said they noticed she looked thin or withdrawn the few times they did see her, but no one felt confident enough to report it. In many communities, people hesitate. They don't want to accuse, they don't want to be wrong. That hesitation can be deadly. Investigators allege that inside the home, Jacqueline endured ongoing abuse. Court documents describe a pattern of mistreatment that included neglect and physical harm. Prosecutors believe Jonathan Nanita, Karla Garcia's boyfriend, was not just present, but actively involved. They allege he exercised control, enforced punishment, and contributed to an environment of fear. What's especially chilling is how quiet it all appears to have been. There were no repeated 911 calls, no noise complaints, no visible injuries reported by doctors. This wasn't chaos spilling into the street. It was harm contained within four walls. Police believe Jacqueline's death occurred months before officers ever arrived at the apartment. The exact cause is still part of the legal process, but investigators allege it was the result of abuse, not an accident. And instead of calling for help, they say the adults made a decision that would define this case. They chose to hide it. According to prosecutors, Jacqueline's body remained inside the apartment for some time after her death. How long remains unclear, but investigators say the delay allowed decomposition to progress and evidence to disappear. Eventually, police allege the decision was made to remove her body entirely. That's where Karla's sister, Jacqueline Garcia, enters the story more clearly. Police allege Jacqueline assisted in moving Jacqueline's body. Court documents suggest she knew Jacqueline was dead and still helped conceal what happened. If proven, that means 3 adults made the same choice, to protect themselves instead of a child. As detectives tracked phone data and location records, they began mapping movements that lined up with the alleged disposal of Jacqueline's remains. Surveillance footage from nearby areas, license plate data, and witness tips all helped narrow the timeline. None of it happened quickly. It took months of careful reconstruction. Meanwhile, Karla Garcia continued telling people her daughter was alive. Investigators say she messaged relatives casually. She answered questions without urgency. She acted, in many ways, like a mother dealing with a difficult child, not a grieving one. That behavior is now central to the prosecution's case. They argue it shows awareness and intent, not denial or shock. Defense attorneys, however, are expected to argue something very different: that Karla was overwhelmed, that she was manipulated, that fear and confusion drove bad decisions after the fact. These arguments haven't yet been fully presented, but they will matter deeply once the case reaches trial. Still, detectives say the evidence tells a consistent story. One of the most troubling discoveries came from inside the apartment itself. Even months after Jacqueline's alleged death, investigators noted signs of attempts to clean and sanitize certain areas. Nothing obvious enough to trigger suspicion at the time, but enough, in hindsight, to raise serious questions. Experts later explained how extensive cleaning can erase obvious evidence while still leaving trace indicators. And yet, during that earlier police visit, none of this was visible. The body cam footage now feels unbearable to watch for those involved in the case. Officers are seen standing calmly, asking about Jacqueline, unaware that the answers they were being given were part of a lie investigators say had already been rehearsed many times. This wasn't a panic response. It wasn't confusion. Police believe it was strategy. As the investigation moved forward, detectives began preparing arrest warrants. Each one laid out a careful narrative, supported by digital evidence, witness statements, and expert analysis. This wasn't just about what happened to Jacqueline, but about how long the truth was deliberately hidden. When arrests were finally made, the shock was widespread. People who knew Karla struggled to reconcile the accusations with the person they thought they knew. That reaction is common in cases like this. Abusers don't look like monsters. They look normal. They blend in. They answer the door. And that's what makes this case so hard to process. Jacqueline didn't vanish overnight. She faded away while people assumed someone else was paying attention. By the time the system caught up, the damage was irreversible. As prosecutors prepare to present their case, one thing is already clear. Jacqueline's suffering didn't begin at death. It happened quietly, over time, while the world kept moving around her. And the next phase of this story would focus on something even more disturbing. Not just what happened in that apartment, but how many chances there were to stop it. Chances that were missed. By the time prosecutors laid out the full timeline, the case stopped being about a single moment and became about a series of missed chances. Not one failure, not one bad call, but many small moments where concern existed and then faded, where questions were asked and answered just enough to quiet them. Investigators began identifying what they now call interruption points. Moments when Jacqueline might still have been alive, moments when intervention could have changed everything. School was the first. Teachers had noticed Jacqueline's absences piling up. Emails were sent. Phone calls were made. Meetings were scheduled and canceled. Each time, Karla Garcia offered explanations that sounded reasonable. Illness, family issues, plans to transfer schools. Nothing that crossed the line into immediate danger. In a system overwhelmed by cases, Jacqueline became another file marked unresolved, not urgent. Then there were relatives. Some family members told police they hadn't seen Jacqueline in months, but assumed she was staying elsewhere. Others said Karla discouraged visits, explaining that Jacqueline was going through things. According to investigators, those explanations worked because they played into something familiar. Families handle their own problems. People don't want to interfere. Police say this isolation was not accidental. According to the warrants, Jacqueline's contact with the outside world slowly disappeared. No friends over, no outings, no social media presence. For a 12-year-old, that level of isolation is extreme. But again, it happened gradually, slowly enough that no single moment screamed danger. One investigator later said, "If this had happened all at once, someone would have noticed. That's not how this case worked." Inside the apartment, police believe Jacqueline's life was controlled down to the smallest details. When she could speak, where she could go, what she could do wrong. Prosecutors allege that punishment became routine and escalated over time. Not chaotic, but systematic. This is where Jonathan Nanita's role becomes more central. According to investigators, Nanita was not a passive presence. Police allege he enforced discipline and participated in the abuse. Witnesses later described him as controlling and intimidating, someone who demanded obedience, not respect, someone whose presence changed the energy in a room. Prosecutors believe Jacqueline was afraid of him. That fear, they say, kept her quiet. By the time police believe Jacqueline died, she had already been invisible for months. Her absence wasn't sudden, it was accepted, and when she stopped existing entirely, the people responsible didn't panic. They adjusted. Investigators say Karla Garcia continued her routines almost immediately. She went to work. She answered messages. She told people what they expected to hear. In private, prosecutors allege decisions were being made about how to hide the truth. This is where the case crosses a line for many people. Police allege Jacqueline's body remained in the apartment for a period of time after her death. They say this was not denial. It was delay. A calculated pause while the adults involved decided what to do next. Eventually, investigators believe the decision was made to move her body somewhere it would not be found easily. That plan, prosecutors say, involved Jacqueline Garcia. According to police, Karla's sister knew Jacqueline was dead. She allegedly helped transport the body, which was sealed inside a plastic tote. The choice of container matters to investigators. It suggests planning. It suggests an effort to contain odor, to delay discovery, to make the body easier to move. When detectives tracked the route to the abandoned home where Jacqueline's remains were eventually found, they noted how ordinary the path was. Streets people drive every day, areas no one questions. Nothing about the location screamed crime. That's what made it effective. For months after Jacqueline's death, life continued as if she had simply gone somewhere else. Birthdays passed, holidays came and went, no missing person posters, no urgent searches, just a quiet absence explained away by adults who police say knew exactly what had happened. When investigators finally uncovered the truth, they were forced to confront something deeply unsettling. This wasn't a case of panic after an accident. It was a case of sustained deception, and deception is harder to spot than violence. The body cam footage from the apartment visit now plays a critical role in that narrative. Prosecutors point to it as evidence of how well the story was maintained. Karla's calm tone, her willingness to speak, her lack of urgency. All of it, they argue, shows awareness, not ignorance. Defense attorneys are expected to challenge that interpretation. They will likely argue trauma, fear, manipulation, and mental health issues. They may claim Karla was under Jonathan Nanita's control, that she acted out of fear, that the situation spiraled beyond her ability to manage. Those arguments will be central to the trial. But for investigators, the evidence paints a different picture. One where choices were made again and again to protect adults instead of a child. As the public learned more details, outrage grew, but so did reflection. Many people began asking themselves uncomfortable questions. How often do we accept explanations because they make us uncomfortable to dig deeper? How many times do we assume someone else is responsible? How many children disappear quietly, without alarms? Jacqueline's case forced those questions into the open, because her story wasn't marked by a single failure. It was marked by a series of silences. Silences from neighbors, from family, from systems stretched thin, and from a child who may not have believed anyone would help her, even if she spoke. The next phase of this case would move from investigation to accountability. Arrests had been made, charges filed, but proving what happened inside that apartment and who is responsible would require something far more difficult. It would require telling a jury how a child can die without anyone noticing, and that is never an easy story to tell. As the case moved from investigation to prosecution, the focus shifted to something just as important as the evidence itself: intent. Not just what happened to Jacqueline Mimi Torres-Garcia, but what the adults around her meant to do, and what they chose not to do when it mattered most. Prosecutors began building their case around a simple but powerful idea. This wasn't a moment of shock followed by fear. This was a series of deliberate actions taken over time. Each choice, they argue, shows awareness, and awareness means responsibility. At the center of it all is Karla Garcia. According to court documents, Karla was Jacqueline's mother, her legal guardian, and the person with the clearest duty to protect her. Prosecutors say that duty was violated long before Jacqueline died. They allege Karla allowed abuse to happen, that she failed to intervene, and when Jacqueline died, instead of seeking help, she made a decision that sealed her fate. Investigators point to Karla's behavior in the months that followed as evidence. She didn't report her daughter missing. She didn't call for medical assistance. She didn't reach out for help. Instead, police say she constructed a narrative designed to explain Jacqueline's absence without inviting scrutiny. This is where the state believes intent becomes undeniable. Text messages recovered from Karla's phone show casual conversation during the time Jacqueline was allegedly already dead. There are no frantic messages, no expressions of grief, no signs of confusion. Prosecutors say this isn't how a mother behaves when her child suddenly dies. They argue it's how someone behaves when they are actively hiding the truth. Defense attorneys are expected to counter that interpretation. They may argue emotional shutdown, trauma, dissociation. They may suggest Karla was overwhelmed or controlled by her boyfriend. These explanations are not uncommon in abuse-related cases, and juries often struggle with them. But prosecutors say the evidence goes further. They argue that Karla didn't just fail to act, she actively misled. She spoke to police calmly. She reassured school officials. She answered questions without hesitation. According to the state, this wasn't survival behavior. It was maintenance of a lie. Then there's Jonathan Nanita. Police allege Nanita was a driving force behind the abuse. According to witness statements, he exercised control over the household and enforced discipline through fear. Prosecutors believe Jacqueline's injuries and eventual death are directly tied to his actions. More importantly, they allege Nanita didn't panic after Jacqueline died. Instead, they say he helped plan the concealment of her body. His phone data and movements are now central to the case. Prosecutors argue that these records show coordination, not chaos. If proven, that coordination undermines any claim of accidental death or spontaneous panic. And then there's Jacqueline Garcia. Her role, prosecutors say, turns this from a tragic household failure into a conspiracy. According to arrest warrants, Jacqueline knew Jacqueline was dead and still assisted in moving and hiding her body. Prosecutors argue that this proves the intent to conceal, not just by one person, but by multiple adults acting together. That's a powerful point in court, because it suggests shared knowledge, shared guilt, and shared decisions. As pre-trial hearings unfolded, the judge reviewed evidence that the public had not yet seen. Detailed timelines, forensic analysis, digital records. Each piece helped establish not just what happened, but when and who knew about it at each stage. One of the most critical issues is time. Prosecutors argue Jacqueline died months before her body was discovered. That gap matters because it shows opportunity after opportunity to tell the truth, to call for help, to stop digging deeper into the lie. Instead, police say the adults doubled down. Public reaction to these revelations has been intense. Many people struggle with the idea that a child could be dead inside a home while life continued around her, that officers could knock on the door and walk away, that school systems could lose track of a student, that family members could accept vague explanations for so long. But experts point out that this pattern is not unique. Children at risk often disappear slowly. Abuse hides behind routine. Lies don't need to be elaborate, just believable. And when multiple adults support the same story, it becomes even harder to challenge. Prosecutors are expected to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. In cases like this, there is rarely a single piece of proof that tells the whole story. Instead, it's the accumulation of small facts that create an undeniable picture. The defense, meanwhile, will likely focus on reasonable doubt, on emotional complexity, on fear and coercion. They may argue that Karla was a victim too, that Jonathan Nanita was the dominant figure, that Jacqueline Garcia acted out of loyalty, not criminal intent. These arguments will matter. But for Jacqueline, the legal strategies don't change the reality of what she lost: her childhood, her safety, her chance to be seen. As the case heads toward trial, prosecutors face a difficult task. They must explain to a jury not only how a child died, but how the truth stayed buried for so long. They must show that this wasn't just a failure of love. It was a failure of duty. And in the next part of this story, we'll look at the forensic evidence, the silent witnesses that remained when words failed, and the science that may ultimately speak for Jacqueline when she no longer can. When words fall apart in court, science steps in. And in the case of Jacqueline, Mimi Torres-Garcia, forensic evidence has become one of the strongest voices speaking on her behalf. Long after lies were told and stories were repeated, her body began telling investigators what really happened. By the time Jacqueline's remains were discovered, nearly a year had passed since she was last seen alive. That passage of time complicated everything. Decomposition had erased some answers, but it also revealed others, ones that prosecutors say point clearly to abuse, neglect, and concealment. According to investigators, Jacqueline's body was found sealed inside a plastic storage tote left behind an abandoned home. The container itself became critical evidence. Forensic experts say bodies placed in sealed containers decompose differently. Moisture builds, gases collect, odors are contained longer. These factors don't just affect how a body breaks down, they also suggest intent. Prosecutors argue the tote was not a random choice. It was large enough to transport a body, strong enough to hold weight, and capable of delaying detection. That matters in court because it suggests planning rather than panic. The condition of Jacqueline's remains was consistent, investigators say, with a body that had been moved after death, not left where she died. Soil, fibers, and trace materials found inside and outside the container are being analyzed to establish where the body was kept before it was abandoned. Prosecutors believe this evidence links directly back to Karla Garcia's apartment. Even with decomposition, forensic specialists were able to identify injuries that, according to investigators, did not come from natural causes. While full details are reserved for trial, prosecutors allege the injuries align with patterns seen in long-term abuse cases. Not a single catastrophic injury, but cumulative harm. This is an important distinction. In accidental death cases, injuries often point to one moment, one fall, one impact. But in abuse cases, the body tells a story of repeated trauma over time. Investigators say Jacqueline's remains reflect that kind of history. Medical examiners also focused on signs of neglect. Evidence suggesting malnutrition and lack of proper care became part of the analysis. Prosecutors argue these findings support the idea that Jacqueline's suffering didn't begin at the end. It was ongoing. Time of death was harder to determine due to decomposition, but investigators used multiple methods to narrow the window. Insect activity, environmental conditions, and the state of the remains all contributed to estimates. When combined with phone records, witness statements, and school data, a clearer timeline began to form. That timeline is devastating. According to prosecutors, Jacqueline was already dead by the time police visited the apartment months earlier. That means officers were standing inside a home where a child had died and no one told them. This fact has become one of the most haunting elements of the case. Forensic testing also extended beyond the body. Investigators examined cleaning agents found in the apartment. Certain chemicals, prosecutors say, suggest attempts to sanitize specific areas. While these substances are common household items, experts testified that the volume and placement raised red flags. Again, it's not about one piece of evidence. It's about how everything fits together. Digital forensics played a major role as well. Phone data revealed movements that aligned with the alleged transport of Jacqueline's body. Messages deleted around key dates raised questions. Gaps in location tracking were noted. None of these details alone prove guilt, but together, prosecutors say, they show coordination and awareness. Defense teams are expected to challenge the forensic findings aggressively. They may argue that decomposition makes conclusions unreliable, that injuries could be misinterpreted, that timelines are estimates, not facts. These challenges are common and sometimes effective, but prosecutors believe the totality of evidence will outweigh those doubts. One forensic expert involved in the case reportedly described it as a puzzle where the picture is already clear, even if some pieces are worn. That clarity comes not from certainty in one area, but from consistency across many. Still, the science doesn't explain everything. It can't explain why no one spoke up sooner. It can't explain how a child's suffering went unnoticed. It can't explain the silence. That's where testimony comes in. As the trial approaches, prosecutors plan to call witnesses who knew Jacqueline, teachers, relatives, neighbors, people who interacted with Karla, Jonathan, and Jacqueline during the months Jacqueline was allegedly already dead. Their words will help jurors understand not just what happened, but how easily it was hidden. Because forensic evidence may prove abuse and concealment, but it's human behavior that explains how the lie survived. And in the next part of this story, we'll examine the psychological dynamics inside that household, the control, the fear, and the patterns that experts say often lead to cases like this. Patterns that, once recognized, can save lives. When experts talk about cases like Jacqueline Mimi Torres-Garcia's, they often say the same thing. The crime doesn't start with violence. It starts with control. And as investigators dug deeper into the dynamics inside that apartment, a familiar and deeply disturbing pattern began to take shape. According to prosecutors, the household was ruled by fear long before Jacqueline died. Psychologists who study child abuse describe a slow tightening of power. Rules increase. Freedom disappears. Punishment becomes unpredictable. Over time, the child learns that speaking up makes things worse, not better. Investigators believe Jacqueline lived in that kind of environment. Jonathan Nanita, police say, was the dominant figure in the home. Witnesses described him as strict, intimidating, and easily angered. Prosecutors allege that discipline crossed into abuse, and that Jacqueline was often the target, not because she was worse than other children, but because she was vulnerable. Experts explain that abusers often choose the child least likely to be believed. Jacqueline was young. She was isolated. She depended entirely on the adults around her. That made her easy to silence. According to investigators, Karla Garcia did not protect her daughter from this environment. Whether out of fear, dependence, or choice is something the jury will ultimately decide. But prosecutors argue that Karla reinforced the control instead of breaking it. She echoed explanations. She minimized concerns. She shut down outside contact. That behavior, experts say, is common in households where abuse is normalized. Over time, Jacqueline's world shrank. School became inconsistent. Friends disappeared. Adults stopped asking questions. And inside the home, police believe the abuse escalated. This escalation matters. In many fatal child abuse cases, the final incident isn't dramatically different from previous ones. The only difference is that the child's body can no longer endure it. Prosecutors believe that's what happened here. Not a sudden, shocking act, but the final step in a long pattern. After Jacqueline's death, that same pattern of control shifted direction. Instead of controlling a child, investigators say the adults controlled the story. Experts describe this as collective silence. When more than one adult knows the truth, the lie becomes easier to maintain. Each person reinforces the other. Doubt fades. Responsibility feels shared, and therefore lighter. This is where Jacqueline Garcia's role becomes psychologically significant. Prosecutors allege that when Karla's sister learned Jacqueline was dead, she didn't react with shock or urgency. Instead, they say she helped. That decision, experts argue, suggests more than loyalty. It suggests acceptance of the narrative already in place. Once a lie becomes the group's reality, breaking it feels like betrayal. Investigators believe this dynamic allowed months to pass without intervention. The adults told themselves they were avoiding trouble, avoiding consequences, avoiding judgment. But in doing so, they erased Jacqueline completely. Psychologists often describe this as moral disengagement. When people convince themselves that the harm is already done, that nothing can fix it, they justify actions that would otherwise feel unthinkable. Hide the body, say she moved away, act normal. Each step becomes easier than the last. For the outside world, Karla Garcia's behavior now looks chillingly calm. but experts caution against assuming calm equals innocence or guilt. In abusive households, emotional numbness is common. Some people shut down to survive. The key difference, prosecutors argue, is choice. At any point, Karla could have called for help. She could have told police the truth when they stood in her home. She could have stopped the lie. According to the state, she didn't, because she didn't want to. The defense may argue she couldn't. This tension between couldn't and wouldn't will be one of the most important battles in court. But one thing experts agree on is this. Jacqueline's silence didn't mean she wasn't suffering. Children often don't report abuse because they believe no one will help them, or worse, that reporting will make things worse. In this case, investigators believe Jacqueline had reason to believe both. As public attention grew, many people began asking the same painful question. Why didn't she tell someone? Experts say that question misunderstands abuse. Children don't measure danger the way adults do. They measure safety by predictability. And in abusive homes, silence often feels safer than honesty. By the time Jacqueline died, prosecutors believe she had already been taught that her pain didn't matter. That belief didn't end with her death. It continued in the way her body was treated, in the way her absence was explained, in the way her life was quietly erased from daily routines. And that's what makes this case so disturbing, because it wasn't driven by chaos or desperation. It was driven by order, by control, by a shared decision to pretend nothing had happened. As the trial approaches, jurors will be asked to understand not just facts, but human behavior. Why people stay silent, why they protect abusers, why lies can feel easier than truth, and they will be asked to decide whether fear excuses responsibility. In the next part of this story, we'll turn to the courtroom itself, where these psychological dynamics collide with the law, and where every action, every silence, and every choice will be examined under oath. Because for Jacqueline, the silence is finally ending. When the case finally entered the courtroom, the silence that had surrounded Jacqueline Mimi Torres-Garcia for so long was replaced with something else entirely: scrutiny. Every decision, every delay, every word spoken or not spoken was about to be examined in public, under oath. For prosecutors, this was the moment the story had to come together. They began by laying out a clear narrative for the jury. Not a complicated one, not an emotional appeal. Just a simple truth, they argued. A child was abused, she died, and the adults who were supposed to protect her chose to hide it. From the start, the prosecution focused on responsibility. They reminded jurors that this case was not about perfection. Parents make mistakes, families struggle. But this case, they argued, crossed far beyond that. It was about choices made after a child's life had ended. The first witnesses were those who knew Jacqueline before she disappeared. Teachers spoke about her absences, about emails sent and calls made, about concern that never quite turned into alarm. Their testimony wasn't dramatic, but it was powerful. It showed how Jacqueline slowly slipped through the cracks. Then came law enforcement. Officers who visited Karla Garcia's apartment months after Jacqueline's alleged death took the stand. They described the visit as routine at the time. No screaming, no visible distress. Karla answered questions calmly. She said Jacqueline wasn't there. She offered explanations that seemed plausible. Prosecutors replayed body cam footage for the jury, not to shock, but to contrast. They asked jurors to consider what the officers didn't know, that Jacqueline was already dead, that her body would later be found sealed in plastic, that the calm tone wasn't peace, it was concealment. The defense objected, arguing interpretation. Calm behavior, they said, is not proof of guilt. And they're right, on its own. But prosecutors didn't stop there. They followed the footage with forensic experts who testified about time of death estimates, about how long Jacqueline had likely been gone by the time police stood in that apartment. That testimony reframed the video entirely. It wasn't just an interaction. It was a missed truth. Next came digital evidence, phone records, location data, messages. Prosecutors walked jurors through timelines showing movements that aligned with the alleged disposal of Jacqueline's body. They pointed out deleted messages, periods of silence, patterns that, they argued, showed coordination between Karla, Jonathan Nanita, and Jacqueline Garcia. The defense pushed back hard. They reminded jurors that phones don't tell intentions, that location data isn't exact, that deleted messages don't automatically mean guilt. And again, they were right, to a point. That's the challenge in cases like this. There is no single piece of evidence that screams, "This is it." Instead, there are dozens of pieces that whisper the same thing. One of the most emotional moments came when medical experts testified. They spoke about injuries consistent with abuse, about signs of neglect, about how Jacqueline's body reflected long-term suffering, not a sudden event. The courtroom was quiet. Experts explained how children in abusive homes often don't seek help, how isolation hides harm, how death is often the final outcome of patterns that were ignored. Defense attorneys cross-examined carefully, questioning certainty, highlighting limits, emphasizing that science can estimate, but not always prove exact causes. This back and forth is expected. It's how the system works. But for many jurors, the emotional weight was already heavy. Then came the testimony about concealment. Prosecutors described the plastic tote, the abandoned location, the delay in discovery. They argued that these actions required planning, cooperation, and awareness. This wasn't someone frozen in fear. This was someone taking steps to avoid being caught. The defense argued panic. They suggested the adults were overwhelmed, that fear took over, that once the first bad decision was made, it snowballed. These arguments aim at empathy, and sometimes they work. But prosecutors return to one central question. At what point does fear stop being an excuse? When police came to the door, that was a chance. When school officials asked questions, that was a chance. When months passed, that was a chance. And each time prosecutors argued, the truth was withheld. As the trial moved forward, jurors were asked to do something difficult, to separate sympathy from responsibility, to understand trauma without excusing harm, to decide whether silence can be criminal. Because this case isn't just about what happened to Jacqueline, it's about what didn't happen afterward. No call for help, no confession, no attempt to make things right. Just a decision to move forward without her. In the next part of this story, we'll look at the defense strategies more closely, how they try to explain the unexplainable, and what they ask the jury to believe in the face of overwhelming loss. Because in a courtroom, truth isn't just about facts, it's about which story holds. By the time the defense stood to present its case, the courtroom had already heard weeks of painful testimony. A child abused, a body hidden, months of silence. Now, defense attorneys faced the hardest task of all, explaining how those facts could exist without criminal intent. Their strategy did not deny that Jacqueline Mimi Torres-Garcia was dead. It did not deny that her body was concealed. Instead, it focused on why the adults acted the way they did, and whether those actions rose to the level of the crimes charged. For Karla Garcia's defense, the argument centered on fear and dependence. Defense attorneys painted Karla not as a mastermind, but as a woman trapped in a controlling relationship. They described Jonathan Nanita as the dominant force in the home, the one who set rules, enforced punishment, and created an atmosphere of intimidation. According to the defense, Karla was emotionally worn down, isolated, and afraid of what would happen if she defied him. They told the jury that Karla didn't act because she felt powerless. In their version of events, Jacqueline's death was not something Karla planned or wanted. It was something she didn't know how to stop, and once it happened, fear took over. Fear of losing everything, fear of retaliation, fear of prison, fear of telling the truth and facing consequences she believed she couldn't survive. Defense attorneys emphasized that trauma does not always look like panic. Sometimes, they argued, it looks like numbness, like routine, like going to work the next day because stopping feels impossible. They asked jurors to consider whether Karla's calm behavior was not deception, but survival. Then came Jonathan Nanita's defense. His attorneys focused on reasonable doubt. They challenged the prosecution's claims that he was the primary abuser. They questioned witness credibility. They argued that there was no direct evidence tying him to Jacqueline's fatal injuries. No eyewitness, no confession, no clear forensic proof that placed the final act in his hands. They argued that prosecutors were asking jurors to fill in gaps with assumptions. Nanita's defense also attacked the timeline, pointing out inconsistencies in time-of-death estimates and emphasizing the limits of forensic science when decomposition is involved. They reminded jurors that likely and consistent with are not the same as certain. For Jacqueline Garcia, the defense leaned heavily on loyalty and shock. Her attorneys argued that Jacqueline did not cause Jacqueline's death, that she was brought into the situation after the fact, that she made a terrible decision under emotional pressure, but not a criminal one. According to the defense, Jacqueline acted out of misguided loyalty to her sister, not intent to commit a crime. They argued she didn't fully understand the legal consequences of helping conceal the body, that she was reacting, not planning. Throughout closing arguments, the defense returned again and again to one theme. This was a tragedy compounded by bad decisions, not a coordinated crime. They asked jurors to consider doubt. Doubt about intent, doubt about control, doubt about certainty, and they warned against judging behavior through the lens of hindsight. But the prosecution was ready for that. In their rebuttal, they acknowledged fear, they acknowledged trauma, but they drew a firm line between explanation and excuse. Fear, they argued, may explain silence, but it does not justify hiding a child's body for months. They reminded jurors that Karla had chances to speak up when Jonathan was not present, that she spoke to police calmly, that she answered questions without hesitation, that she maintained the lie consistently, even when no immediate threat existed. They reminded jurors that Jacqueline Garcia didn't call for help. She didn't tell anyone. She helped conceal. And they reminded jurors that Nanita didn't just live in the home, he allegedly helped shape the environment that led to Jacqueline's death. The prosecution ended with a simple but devastating point. Jacqueline had no advocate in life. This jury was her advocate in death. As the jury was sent to deliberate, the courtroom fell silent once again. The families waited. The attorneys waited. The world outside waited. Because the verdict wouldn't just determine guilt or innocence, it would decide whether silence, control, and concealment could be held accountable under the law. And in the final part of this story, we'll look at what this case leaves behind, the verdicts, the lessons, and the haunting reality of a child whose voice was ignored for far too long. When the jury finally returned to the courtroom, the weight of what they carried was visible on their faces. This was not a case built on a single moment caught on camera or a clear confession. It was built on silence, patterns, and choices made behind closed doors. And now, those choices were about to be judged. The courtroom stood still as the verdicts were read. Each name, each charge, each pause between words. For Jacqueline Mimi Torres-Garcia, this was the first time the system fully spoke her name out loud, with intention, with gravity. Not as a missing child, not as a rumor, but as a victim. Prosecutors had asked the jury to look beyond sympathy and focus on responsibility. The defense had asked them to consider fear, pressure, and doubt. In the end, jurors were forced to decide where compassion ends and accountability begins. The verdicts reflected that struggle. Some charges stuck firmly, others were weighed more carefully. But what mattered most was the message. Jacqueline's death was not invisible anymore. The months of silence did not erase what happened. The calm answers at the door did not undo the truth. As sentencing hearings approached, victim impact statements brought the case into sharper focus. Family members spoke about the Jacqueline they remembered, a girl who laughed easily, who liked simple things, who deserved safety. Their words weren't polished or dramatic, they were raw, and they reminded everyone in the room that this case was never just about legal arguments. It was about a child who didn't get to grow up. The prosecution emphasized the long-term harm of concealment. They argued that hiding Jacqueline's body didn't just delay justice, it denied her dignity. It denied her a proper goodbye. It denied her the care she deserved even in death. Defense attorneys asked for mercy. They spoke about remorse, about consequences already suffered, about families destroyed. They asked the court to see their clients as flawed humans, not monsters. And in doing so, they highlighted one of the hardest truths in cases like this. People who do terrible things often don't look terrible. The judge listened carefully. Then came sentencing. Each sentence reflected not just the crime, but the court's view of intent, of choice, of responsibility. It was clear that the court recognized the difference between a tragic outcome and deliberate concealment, between fear and action, between helplessness and participation. For many watching, the sentences didn't feel like enough. Others felt they were severe. That divide is common in child abuse cases. No amount of prison time feels proportional to a child's life. But justice in this system is not about balance. It's about acknowledgement. Outside the courthouse, public reaction was immediate and emotional. Some questioned how this could have happened without intervention. Others focused on the police visit, asking whether things should have gone differently. Law enforcement agencies responded by emphasizing policy limits: no warrant, no visible danger, no legal authority to search. That explanation, while accurate, felt hollow to many. Because this case wasn't just about one failure. It was about a chain. A system that relies on reports. A community that relies on assumptions. A family that relied on silence. In the weeks that followed, child welfare advocates pointed to Jacqueline's case as a warning, not about evil strangers, but about danger inside homes that look normal from the outside. They emphasized how gradual isolation is one of the most common signs of abuse, how school absences, vague explanations, and controlled access to a child should never be ignored. Some school districts reviewed attendance policies. Some agencies revisited missing child procedures. These changes won't bring Jacqueline back, but they may protect someone else. Still, there was a haunting question that lingered. What if someone had pushed harder? What if one report had gone further? What if one adult had refused to accept the explanation? What if one moment had gone differently? Those questions don't have answers, but they matter. Because Jacqueline didn't disappear in a dramatic way. She faded. And fading is harder to notice. As the case faded from headlines, Jacqueline's name remained etched in court records, in policy discussions, and in the memories of those who followed her story. She became a reminder of what silence can cost. And for many parents watching, the case struck a personal nerve. It forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Protecting children isn't just about loving them. It's about noticing when something feels wrong and refusing to look away. The law eventually closed this case, but its impact didn't end there, because Jacqueline's story now lives as a lesson, one written not in headlines, but in absence, in missed chances, in the quiet moments where someone could have spoken up. In the final part of this story, we'll step back from the courtroom and look at what Jacqueline's case teaches us, not just about crime, but about responsibility, vigilance, and the cost of silence. Because remembering her means more than knowing what happened. It means making sure it doesn't happen again. When the courtroom doors finally closed and the case of Jacqueline Mimi Torres-Garcia faded from the daily news cycle, what remained was not closure, but reflection. Cases like this never really end. They linger in the background, resurfacing whenever someone asks how a child could suffer so quietly for so long without rescue. Jacqueline's story is not unique because of how it ended. It is unique because of how long it went unnoticed. There was no dramatic disappearance, no Amber Alert, no frantic search. Just a child who slowly vanished from public view while adults explained her absence away. That's what makes this case so important and so unsettling. It forces us to confront a hard truth. Danger doesn't always announce itself. Often, it whispers. Jacqueline's life was narrowed one excuse at a time. School absences that were explained, visits that were discouraged, questions that were answered just enough to stop them from continuing. Each moment felt small. Together, they became fatal. This is how many abuse cases survive, not through violence alone, but through normalcy, through routines that don't raise alarms, through polite conversations that don't demand proof, through systems that depend on someone, somewhere, to push harder. Jacqueline needed someone to push harder. Her case shows how abuse thrives in isolation. When a child is cut off from friends, teachers, and trusted adults, the abuse doesn't have to be extreme to be deadly. It just has to be constant. And when fear becomes part of daily life, silence feels safer than honesty. That silence didn't end with her death. It continued in the way her body was hidden, in the way her absence was normalized, in the way adults chose self-preservation over truth. And that is the part of this story that stays with people. Because it wasn't just one person who failed Jacqueline. It was a chain of people, systems, and assumptions. None of them intended harm. All of them played a role. This case reminds us that protecting children is not a passive responsibility. It requires discomfort. It requires asking follow-up questions. It requires not accepting vague answers when something feels off. It requires courage. For law enforcement, Jacqueline's case has become a painful example of the limits of authority. Officers can't act on instinct alone. They need legal cause. And when lies are calm and consistent, the truth can stay hidden in plain sight. This doesn't mean police didn't care. It means the system depends on information it never received. For schools, it highlights the danger of assuming continuity. When a child disappears from attendance records without clear confirmation of transfer or safety, that absence should never be treated as routine. For communities, it challenges the instinct to stay out of family matters. Abuse survives in that hesitation. It grows in the space between suspicion and certainty. And for parents, it is a reminder that love is not just protection, it's attention. It's noticing changes. It's believing children when they pull away. It's asking why. Jacqueline never had the chance to explain her pain. She never got the chance to grow into who she might have been. But her story has become a warning, and warnings save lives when people listen. True crime stories often focus on the shocking moment, the arrest, the verdict, the sentence. But the real lesson usually lives before all of that, in the quiet build-up, where something feels wrong long before it becomes undeniable. Jacqueline's life mattered, not because of how it ended, but because it should have been protected. Remembering her means more than knowing her name. It means changing how we respond to silence. It means understanding that calm explanations don't always mean safety. And it means refusing to let children disappear quietly, because the most dangerous crimes are not always loud. Sometimes they happen while the door is answered politely, the questions are deflected gently, and the truth waits, unseen, just on the other side of the wall. And if there is one thing Jacqueline's story teaches us, it's this: pay attention to what's missing. Sometimes that's where the truth is hiding.